So, Tom, over the weekend, cancel culture reared its ugly head again.
What got canceled now, Dave?
This time it was Snow White.
Oh, Snow White.
So they've been making their way through the Disney movies, through the kids' toys, all of these things.
Yeah.
And apparently Snow White propagates rape culture when Prince Charming decides to lean down and kiss Snow White to bring her back when she was unconscious.
I had no idea. I'm terribly guilty then of promoting the same thing. When my daughter was very young, she would have been, like 2.5. A woman I worked with at the Claremont Institute, we were very good friends. Her name was Penny, and she was a master seamstress. She could make anything.
Okay.
She made a satiny Snow White dress. I'm not talking about the kind you get in the store that has like a picture of Snow White. No. When you look at the cartoon or the movie, she made a dress that looked exactly like that. And my daughter wore that, I think, every day for a year or year and a half.
well, there are a lot of progressives out there today who would say that you were teaching your daughter to have rape fantasies.
Oh, my goodness. Wow.
Can you imagine?
I had no idea.
I think you need to pay for more therapy. I think she all of a sudden needs to start realizing the problem she went through. I'm actually surprised that we've gotten to Snow White and they've skipped over a big one. They've skipped over the Wizard of Oz. And when you think about it, the Wizard of Oz is essentially telling the world exactly what they're doing. The Wizard of Oz is actually revealing to the entire world that this whole progressive idea,
just a little guy behind the curtain,
is just some little guy with a Napoleon complex behind the curtain saying, "Hey, I'm gonna scare you into a whole lot of things, and you're gonna worship me, and if you worship me, and if you make me your God, right? The civic religion.
That's right.
If you make me your God, forget anything else you've been taught in theology. If you make me your civic God, I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to give you everything. I'm going to give the lion his courage, and I'm going to give the Tin Man his heart, and I'm going to help Dorothy get home."
Oh, and don't forget the Scarecrow. He needs a brain.
Oh, Scarecrow needs a brain.
If he only had a brain.
Right. I need a Scarecrow on my balcony right now.
I remember that song. He'd be thinking like a Lincoln if he only had a brain. You know, before we move off of Disney, I got to add, I hadn't thought about this before you mentioned Snow White. Disneyland. I've never been to Disney World in Florida, but I have been to Disneyland. I lived out in Southern California for a long time. It's a very patriotic place. Walt Disney loved the United States, and he wanted to create this sort of picturesque little downtown. There's a main street there, and it's this sort of idealized memory of what America used to be. Great tribute being paid to Abraham Lincoln, to the American founders. I would think Disneyland itself, the entire theme park, probably is next on the chopping block.
Well, he makes up for it with Disney World, where you can go to Epcot Center and visit all of the different cultures of the world.
That's right.
It's actually, I will say this, they do a wine and food festival at Disney World, and you go to each of these little countries, these setups, and you
get to appropriate their cultures?
Yes, you get to appropriate their cultures. Apparently, maybe Disney World should be canceled too. But that's the reality here, right? What is happening, what the reality of progressivism is this little guy behind a curtain projecting this big image of, I can save you and I'm going to help you, and I have all the power in the world to do anything you need from me.
Yep.
And if you just believe it, but if you peek behind that curtain, you realize what's going on.
I'm picturing right now that famous scene when they get inside the Emerald City, and the first time they see the wizard, and he's this big, like, supernatural, right? This great big giant head projected up there, and there's fire and everything. And I can hear him right now saying, "Silence, Tin Man! I will solve poverty. I will cure diseases. I will make sure everyone has a minimum wage that's a living minimum wage." And everything else.
Did you ever think, by the way, and I want to get back to the minimum wage thing in a second, but did you ever think for a second the similarities between Wizard of Oz and 1984? The big brother on the wall who's talking to everybody and telling you everything will be okay. You just do what you're supposed to do and follow the rules and do everything I say and everything will be okay and we won't get killed by your age. What was the
Eurasians
and whatever else it was. So the minimum wage, you brought up the minimum wage, and it's a perfect example of it's what the Wizard of Oz is doing. It's what the progressives are doing behind the curtain. Mm-hmm. They're having this big debate over here. They're talking about this big debate over minimum wage and what should it be. And they're saying, well, we're not sure if we can get $15 an hour. We think it should be at least $15 an hour. AOC is saying we're compromising at $15 an hour. It really should be 25 or 30.
And there are all kinds of facets to that conversation, right? Income gap is growing between the rich and the poor. And of course, a big part of that conversation always is corporations are greedy. Corporations, right. It's interesting to see when politicians and journalists in the media use the word corporations versus businesses, because every business is a corporation, right? But when they want to make it something nefarious, they call it's corporations, greedy corporations not paying their fair share. And so all those are elements of this big conversation. Right. And that's sort of like the big image of the wizard, right? That's what you're supposed to look at and listen to and pay attention to.
So what's happening behind the curtain? Behind the curtain, the wizard, the government, the progressives are out here cutting checks. We talked about this in last week's podcast. Mm-hmm. They're out there cutting checks to people to stay home.
Yep.
They're out there cutting checks to say, we know we've shut down all these businesses and you can't find jobs and we're going to just keep paying you. And people are making upwards of $40,000 plus a year to stay home.
I'm not going to use any names here because I don't want to embarrass anyone or upset anyone, but a local restaurant that we enjoy and we actually use as part of our Vino Veritas Society chapter meetings, they were started to close on Sundays, and now they are closing on Sundays, Mondays, and Tuesdays, not because there's no business. There's lots of business. They can't get employees.
So why can't they get employees? They can't get employees because the government's paying them to stay home.
Yep.
What's really happening is this wizard, this progressive behind the curtain, is saying, I want a $25 minimum wage. I know I can't get that passed in Congress. But if I pay people enough to stay home, you as a business are going to have to pay more.
Yep.
And when you pay more, all of a sudden now that business is going to have to match that $25 wage that the government wants you to be paying them.
Which is why Joe Biden and other progressive politicians are out there urging that we keep these very high unemployment benefits, but basically make it permanent.
Right.
Make it permanent so that business has to compete with that.
Which sounds eerily familiar to universal basic income.
Yes, it does.
Right. And so what happens, everybody gets this money. I wanted to go to that restaurant, the very restaurant you were just talking about. Mm-hmm. I wanted to go for dinner on Sunday night. I had plans with a friend. We were going to go grab dinner there on Sunday night. And then I found out they were closed. Where are you going to spend your money if all the businesses you want to use it at, right. If all the people you want to openly, freely exchange in services and goods, they're all going to be closed. You're going to have to eat at Walmart, or you're going to have to figure out something else. But this whole thing, the downward spiral, this is why all of these progressive ideas that they're projecting up on the wall and saying, Hey, Americans, go fight over this. Mm-hmm. We're going to do this over here behind the curtain, and it's going to create the same desired effect.
Yep.
As you think about that, I started to think about, where have we seen this before? And we saw it before in the 1930s and early 1940s under FDR.
Yeah, in a big way.
Right? We had FDR coming through and trying to control everything. Yep. Say, hey, Mr. Filburn, you can't grow any crops on this portion of your land, even if you're not selling it. So is that the next step in this? Well, not only can you not go to the restaurant you want to, but you can't buy the ingredients at the store to actually cook the meal you want at home.
Or you may not be able to buy the ingredients. At the same time, you may not be allowed to grow the ingredients, right? In the case of Filburn, as you're talking about. I mean, when you look back at – here's the great challenge of the New Deal, trying to understand, get your mind around FDR and the New Deal, that whole period typically associated with the Great Depression, the 1930s, the 1940s. The myths and the illusions. Think back of the Wizard of Oz, the big head and the fire, right? It's all meant to distract. It's an illusion. That's not really the Wizard of Oz. The myths and the illusions have become accepted as reality. I mean, in a way, I sort of feel like we're back into a philosophy 101 discussion of Plato and the allegory of the cave here, trying to differentiate between what is real and what is just an illusion, an image of real things. So, in the case of the New Deal and FDR, the first place, and we're going to cover this in more depth. We're going to do some toolbox videos on this subject and get more into it. But I'll throw out a few basic things here. One part of the New Deal myth is that business, free markets, capitalism caused the Great Depression.
Right.
And that myth sort of sets up the second part of the myth, which is New Deal government programs saved America from capitalism, right? And the whole thing is fraudulent. The whole thing is an image. It falls apart when you really start looking into it. All kinds of things were happening throughout the 20s, including a big part of the problem goes all the way back to World War I. After World War I, the United States had loaned a lot of money to a lot of allied countries to help them regroup, rebuild. And to their credit, a lot of those countries were paying back to the United States what they owed. And then in the late 1920s, a Republican president, Hoover, who was very much a progressive.
Right.
And I know this is a little, for a lot of Americans, these gears clash when you say progressive Republican. It's true. There have been many progressive Republicans.
Absolutely.
They believe in central planning. They believe in big bureaucratic government control. And Herbert Hoover was one of them. He just wasn't as progressive as Franklin Roosevelt, who came after him. But Hoover and Congress passed the biggest increase in tariffs in all of American history on thousands of items. And so Americans were no longer buying imported goods from dozens of other nations. And so those dozens of other nations, they responded with their own tariffs against American goods. And so all of a sudden, foreign demand for American crops, American products, American cars, American transistor radios went way, way, way down. This is happening at the same time we have a Federal Reserve System that did not understand monetary theory. Milton Friedman hadn't invented it yet.
Do they understand that today?
I don't think they do.
Okay.
And
Just
yet they are mucking around with interest rates, national interest rates that affect all the banks with the money supply. My point is there's all kinds of, not least of which is a huge increase in taxes that happens in the early 1930s. So right as demand is going down, businesses are starting to slow down, lay people off, cut back on their inventory. What does government do? It comes along and says, oh, we're going to take more than ever before in the form of taxes. So there's all kinds of government involvement. This is not a free market. This isn't capitalism. This is heavy government control that leads to the crash of the market in 1929 and the economic crisis that follows in the early 1930s. So it's not that free people freely trading and freely producing, that didn't cause the economic crisis. Government intervention did. And then FDR gets elected, and what does he propose as the solution? Government intervention, more government intervention. And this is the big second part of this illusion. This is the big fiery, smoky picture of the great Oz. I'm Franklin Roosevelt, and I have this big administrative apparatus, all the Department of Labor and the Office of Price and Wage Controls, and we're going to solve these problems. All of this government control not only didn't solve the problems, they made the problems deeper and longer.
Sure.
This thing gets stretched out for nearly 2 decades. And yet there are millions of Americans, including scholars and teachers and historians, as well as pundits and journalists, as well as many ordinary citizens who genuinely believe that Roosevelt's New Deal government policies and programs somehow saved America from free markets, from capitalism, when it's exactly the opposite is the truth.
Well, and here's what's amazing about it. He freely admits early in his administration, what we're about a one term in.
Yep.
He freely admits everything I've been trying to do isn't working.
Yep.
We have failed. He's telling the Tin Man, sorry, I haven't given you a heart yet. I'm trying, but I haven't given you a heart yet. And Mr. Scarecrow, you haven't gotten a brain yet. I'm sorry, but I'm trying.
I want to make sure our listeners know, so he was first elected in 1932, and he does get elected 4 times. He dies early in his 4th term, so he doesn't serve much of it. But he was elected 4 terms, and first election is 1932. In 1936, the Democratic National Committee renominates him, and their national convention is in Philadelphia. And that's where he gives an acceptance speech, and he acknowledges all these things you're saying. We haven't delivered. We haven't delivered the jobs we promised. We haven't delivered the food, the health care. We've delivered. In fact, most of these metrics have gotten worse. But he says in that speech, our intentions are good.
Right.
and so who are you going to trust and believe in? Warm-blooded liberals who love you and care about you and are working around the clock to try to micromanage this economy so it's good for you, or businesses and capitalists who are frozen, this is the phrase he uses, frozen in icy indifference and don't care if you live or die. They only care about making a profit.
It's funny you quote that. And I have in front of me an article from, I believe it was the 12th of April, so a few weeks ago, that was in the New York Times op-ed section, talking about Joe Biden as the heir to FDR. That Joe Biden
They don't mean the error, right? ERROR. The error that FDR made is the error. That's not what they mean.
No, the HEIR, the heir to FDR.
Yeah.
And this article, it's almost painful to read. And I've read it a few times just because I'm trying to get a full picture of how much the crossover between FDR and FDR's approach throughout his 13 years in office to what Biden has done in his first 100 days. And remember that 100 days benchmark was originally set by FDR.
That's right.
Too. FDR was the first one who said you can set the first benchmark of a presidency by the accomplishments of the first 100 days.
Yep.
So Biden's now May 1st, or just this week, was Biden's first 100 days in office, and we can start analyzing, and we're starting to see that Biden really is the way that FDR was that Wizard of Oz. He was this image of something and actually projected something else, or actually did something else. That Biden's doing the same thing. And one of the opening paragraphs of this article actually uses the full quote that you're talking about. And I underlined it because it was so important, because it's what he said right before the comment of government frozen in the ice of its own indifference.
Yeah.
Do you remember the first half of that line says, better the occasional faults of a government that lives in the spirit of charity than the consistent omissions of a government frozen in the ice of its own indifference.
Yep. So we progressives in government, like Joe Biden and Franklin Roosevelt, we are charitable, right? We are turning government into a charity.
Right.
Charities give away help, give away resources. That's what we want to do. It's better for us to be charitable and give free stuff away and make some errors every now and then. We have our faults. We're human. We're not perfect. Than to be a government frozen in icy indifference and not care how you're doing in your life.
So think about how you can couch that. You can say, hey, look, we were just giving $42,000 a year in salary for you to stay home. We didn't mean to destroy every small business in this country. We didn't mean to destroy the entire restaurant industry. We didn't mean to destroy – there was somebody else who I just heard closed for the same reason. That wasn't even a restaurant type business. I mean, all of these companies – I have a friend who owns a packaging and shipping company. He can't have employees anymore. He can't afford what it costs them to start showing up. He's now working 90, 100 hours a week just to keep that open.
And anyone who's run a business, especially a small business, knows that the profit margins of most small businesses are razor thin. In fact, it's even worse than razor thin. what is typical with small businesses is that you have weeks and months and periods of loss. Yep. You're actually losing money. And then you might have some weeks and months where you make a profit. And so it's this up and down, up and down. You're never quite sure if you're going to make it through the next month or the next quarter or the next year.
Well, you have to plan accordingly to say,
that's right.
I know you have to get to know a business well enough.
That's
you have
right.
to be in it long enough to start to know when are your peaks and when are your valleys. Yep. You think about this same packaging and shipping company. He knows that he makes a lot of money during Christmas time. Mm-hmm. He makes a lot of money during September when students are off at school and their parents are sending them care packages to their kids. But in the middle of July, there's not a lot of work, and there's not a lot coming through. In the middle of March, Valentine's Day is over, all of that kind of stuff.
Yep.
He knows that he has to take the money in December that he makes from Christmas, and that's got to last him the next 3 or 4 months. He can't say, wow, I just had an awesome Christmas season. I'm going to go buy a new car.
And so I want to be real clear here. When government says, hey, we'll pay people $42,000 to stay home and do nothing, what that means for that guy's business, he now has to start, he might have to pay 30, 40, 50% more in wages to get someone to come work because he's competing against $42,000 to do nothing.
Right.
And it might be that his business model, he can't make his business work. He can't pay 50% more in wages and salaries and be able to run his business.
It simply doesn't work. And this is one of the problems with the wizard. This is one of the great problems with progressivism is that they look at every single and progressive citizens, not even just those in the bureaucracy and those in office, but progressive citizens tend to look at every business as if it was Walmart. They tend to look at every business as if it's McDonald's, this huge corporation that can, you make plenty of money and you can afford it. And they create legislation that affects Walmarts and McDonald's of the world.
Right.
And they have no idea how it affects the other 85% of companies out there that live and die by that extra $500 it makes that month.
And let's be clear here, around 85% of new startup businesses fail within 18 months. Fail. I mean, think about that. The vast majority don't make it. And that's without some big increase in wages and salaries. Here's the other thing that progressives tend to do. They look at the world of business and they focus in on one variable, like how much money are employees making? And they'll say, we, it's not my business, but I'm a progressive citizen. I think those employees over at that business should be making more. Not having any idea of the business model for that business. But from the business's point of view, to walk into a business and say you must double the wages of your employees is no different than walking into a business and saying you must double the amount of rent you pay for your building, or you must double the amount you pay for your electrical bills or for your inventory. It's an operating cost. And when operating costs go up, you increase the prices of what you're selling and you try to make your business go, but very often it doesn't work. You can't make it work.
And in the times that it does work, right? In the times where you offer something that's just so invaluable that somebody has to follow through, you're going to destroy 10 other businesses in the long run.
That's right.
Right? We're seeing right now the cost of lumber. A 2x4, a standard 2x4, if you walk into Home Depot or Lowe's or any of these stores right now, a standard 2x4 is $7.50.
Right.
How are you going to build a house?
Right.
When 2x4s cost $7.50, it's not even reasonable. And it wasn't because of increased wages, and it wasn't because of all that. It was in part because Home Depot has to start raising the price of the cost of their employees. But shipping has gotten more expensive. Gas has gotten more expensive.
And most importantly, going back again to government policy, what has government done in communities and cities all across the country over the last years? Shut things down. People stayed home. Well, what did people do when they stayed home? They decided to spruce up their house, do home improvement. So the demand for things like plywood and lumber went way up. Meanwhile, many lumber mills were shut down by these, executive orders. You can't run your business and produce lumber. At the same time, demand for lumber is skyrocketing.
Well, and so that idea of production and producing something physical, that's another comparison we can make between FDR and Joe Biden. FDR really pushed America towards a service-based economy, right? He was trying to shut down a lot of the he knew that a lot of the factories and a lot of the producers, they were the ones making the money. If you're going to tax them, they're going to shut those down. If people still want jobs, they're going to have to go do service industry jobs, right? And he became a very service-focused. He helped convert the United States to much more of a service-based economy. Joe Biden's done the same thing. Joe Biden is pushing for a much more service-based. He's talking about people who are going to go. There were some things in here about his new tree army, about going and planting new trees to save the economy and all of these types of things. But if we become a service-based economy, that service-based economy is largely based on tips. That service-based economy is largely based on low wages.
You're talking about jobs like being a
waiter,
a waiter in a restaurant, something like that.
Something
bartender.
Like that. Right. And all of a sudden now you're going to pay them $42,000 a year. So do you want to go be a service employee who might make money, might not? You're taking a lot of risk based on how much you're going to get in tips. And you're going into a restaurant that presumably because of COVID rules, a lot of people can't go in.
Yeah.
And there's restrictions on how many people can be in there and how many tables can be in there and everything else. So you're restricting the amount of money they can make. You're telling them they can stay home. You're naturally creating a minimum wage.
That's right.
You're creating a minimum wage without ever actually having to go pass a law.
Right.
And that's what the wizard's doing behind the curtain.
That's right. And I want to run with that image of the wizard because it's so useful. That's a great example of a way that progressives are trying to sneak in the back door what they can't get through the front door, right? A minimum wage increase. It's also the case, what we are suggesting here is that progressive programs, policies, think of what government really can do. And it's pretty limited. They can take money from people in the form of taxing them. They can transfer or redistribute that money to others or to themselves or some combination. They can control people. They can restrict what people may and may not do. That's really about it. That's the realm of what government can do. And we're suggesting that government programs, taxing a lot, redistributing, does not create new wealth. It doesn't lead to prosperity. It's not the solution to these crises. And that sort of raises the question, then why do progressives in government keep doing all this? Why have they been doing these things going all the way back to FDR and his, some of his big early programs, the National Industrial Recovery Act. He had all these big fancy terms, the Citizen Conservation Corps, all these things, paying people to rake leaves in parks and build sidewalks and things like this. Unemployment stayed. It not only stayed chronically high, it went up. More people were unemployed, losing their houses in soup kitchens. And then, you fast forward to Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s launches a war on poverty. So you would think, well, my good, didn't the New Deal? It was a New Deal.
Yeah.
Didn't the New Deal make America better and prosperous and happy? Apparently not, because a mere 20 years later, by the 1960s, we needed a great society that featured a war against poverty. We're going to destroy war. We're going to emerge victorious over poverty, and that has led to more than $25 trillion. To give, I want our listeners just to have kind of an idea of what $25 trillion means. $25 trillion has been spent on hundreds of programs connected to the war on poverty. That is more money than has been spent in every military conflict from the American Revolution through the Civil War, through World War I and II, and Korea and Vietnam and Iraq, and through all military conflicts in history. We have spent more on the war on terror. We launched a huge war on drugs. We've launched. Huge...
I was gonna comment on that, and let's keep your theme going.
Okay.
Right? You had the New Deal.
Yep.
And didn't really do a whole lot.
Well, in fact, let's back up just for the sake of being complete here.
Okay.
With Woodrow Wilson, his theme was the new freedom.
Right.
The old kind of free speech, right? Personal liberty, free. That wasn't enough. We need a new kind of freedom. Then you have FDR and you have a New Deal.
How about you go back before Woodrow Wilson, 20 years, you had the New Republic.
That's right, the New Republic, Herbert Croly.
So you had Herbert Croly say the New Republic.
Yeah.
Then you elect Woodrow Wilson, what was it, the New Freedom?
The New Freedom.
The New Freedom. Then you have FDR, the New Deal.
New Deal.
Then you have
Lyndon
the Great
Johnson.
Society.
Yep.
And then less than 30 years later, a little more than 20 years later again, every 20 years, you have Bill Clinton come along and say, okay, we've had this war on poverty, but now we've also had this huge increase in drugs. So let's have a war on drugs.
Yeah.
And now we're, 30 years, little less than 30 years, actually just a little more than 20 years later, we have Joe Biden coming in and saying we need to go. We have a new Green Deal, a new deal.
That's right.
Every 20 years,
that's right.
We have another progressive come along and say that didn't work quite the way we wanted it to.
And and here again, we talked about how progressivism has really crept into both parties to a large extent. I mean, part of that story, the very first president who really talked about a war on drugs was Richard Nixon, a Republican. But here's the big point. These programs never accomplished their goals.
Ever.
Well, let me restate this.
Thank you.
They never accomplished their publicly stated goals.
Right.
The war on poverty did not end poverty. In fact, poverty rates were going down among all Americans prior to the war on poverty, including Americans facing the toughest challenges, like Black Americans. Poverty was going down, even though Black Americans were facing, terrible forms of racism and Jim Crow, and the Ku Klux Klan was still around in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and yet poverty rates were going down. Illiteracy rates were going down. People were flourishing. Americans across the board. We launched the war on poverty. That decline in poverty stops, and it actually starts to go back up.
Right.
And so these programs, the war on drugs not only has it not ended drug abuse today, substance abuse today is worse than ever before in American history. Although we have these big federal agencies and programs, we have a DEA, we have an entire federal drug code enshrined in a statutory law, which brings me to my point. Think back to that Wizard of Oz. There's the big, smoky, fiery image, right? And the little guy behind the screen. You know what's going on behind the curtain? All these government programs have one common real goal: expand the power of government, expand the size of government, hire more bureaucrats, more regulators, get more Americans receiving their paycheck from the government, have the government controlling the lives and the property and the liberties of other Americans. In that respect, if you think about government programs from that point of view, their real goal is to expand the size and power of government.
Yep.
Every one of these government programs has been a smashing success because they all result in government getting bigger and controlling more of our life.
That curtain has gotten substantially larger because you have to hide a lot more people who have gotten involved.
We're like Toto. Because remember, Toto's Dorothy's little dog, and Toto's the one who runs up and pulls the curtain back so everyone can see what's going on.
It's funny. You talked about the expansion, and there was in this article, it was comparing some of the programs that Joe Biden's trying to implement that are going to expand people who are making money from the federal government.
Right.
And it shared some of the numbers from FDR, and these struck me. I noted them. New Deal programs created 20 million jobs. However, 39,000 new schools were built. Mm-hmm. Every one of those employees that services those schools, whether they're teachers, janitors, administrators, anything else,
right,
those are government employees.
Government employees, yep.
2,500 publicly funded hospitals were built. Every single one of those doctors, every single one of those nurses, every janitor, every single person who works there is being paid by the government.
And keep in mind also the contractors who built every mason, every electrician, every plumber, right?
Was going to get there too.
Okay.
325 airports. Airports are public facilities. Think about all the people who work in an airport.
Yeah.
And then you start having to pay the airlines because the airlines can't afford to operate out of 325 airports.
Right.
So you start funding the airlines, and then they start having to do whatever the government says. And then it goes on to say, so it says 325 airports and tens of thousands of smaller projects that did not end the Depression, but eventually helped power the post-American boom.
What an incredible little concession slipped in there.
Right.
Didn't actually end the Depression. Why is that? Because if I think of an unsuspecting person was reading that and here looking at all these numbers saying, wow, all these airports and hospitals and schools and all this other stuff. Surely this solved the economic crisis. But for every dollar that was going to fund the creation of a school or a hospital had to be taken away from somebody. And that was a dollar that was not spent buying a new radio or buying food or hiring an additional employee or expanding a factory or something like that. So it's not creating new wealth. It's not increasing productivity. It's just taking money away from you and giving it to somebody else.
So then you bring up contractors, and I immediately, every time we talk about government contractors, so people like to say, well, they're private businesses, and it's a private-public partnership is what they like to call it, right? And there's two examples that I always think about. We've talked lately that everything is infrastructure, right? Joe Biden, everything is infrastructure.
Daycare is infrastructure.
He's won $6 trillion in new spending, and he's basically labeled all of it infrastructure.
Right.
But there are actually two infrastructure projects, in particular roads specifically, that I think about that are exactly what we're talking about. The first one is the Big Dig in Boston. Do you remember the Big Dig in Boston? So my sister went to school in Boston in the late 80s, early 90s, and went to college there. And it was right when the Big Dig was sort of just becoming like a big thing. Yeah. The plan was 7 years. We're gonna get these guys under contract for 7 years. And there was so much money, and these are all
a tunnel, right?
It was a bunch of tunnels. They were trying to move a lot of the major roadways.
That's right,
underground, so that you could have less traffic interfering with pedestrians wanting to walk about Boston. They wanted to make Boston a more walk-friendly city and bicycle-friendly city, and all of these things. And I suppose they were successful in that. I don't think it's helped traffic at all.
Right.
But that happened. Here's where it got really interesting. It's a government contract. The government's not spending. Remember, we talked about before Milton Friedman's 4 quadrants.
Yes.
And it's spending somebody else's money on somebody else.
Yes.
So the government doesn't care. They want to support unions, the Boston government in particular, the Massachusetts government.
It means they don't care about price or quality.
Right.
Doesn't really matter.
And when you have people like Elizabeth Warren, who are these key figures in Massachusetts, saying, okay, we're going to use unions. Joe Biden loves his unions, and we're going to use unions. And so they paid extraordinary salaries to these contractors to come in and work. And everybody wanted those jobs. So people from all over the country start flocking to Boston. So you get this huge influx of people. 7 years later, the Big Dig's supposed to be over. And somebody looks around and says, if we end this, we're going to have a homeless problem. So much for the war on poverty, right?
Right.
So what happens? It's still going today. They've just kept these contractors employed. They keep running up debt. They keep borrowing money because they have to keep all of these contractors employed. And the people of Massachusetts just keep approving it.
About 2 weeks ago, I flew through LaGuardia Airport in New York. And someone it was a group, we were on a business trip. And one of the people with us, she used to be in sales. And she used to fly in and out of LaGuardia 20, 25 years ago. And she was saying, LaGuardia was under construction 25 years ago.
It never stopped.
It's still under the whole thing is torn up. It is a nightmare getting in and out of that airport. And they have these flashy renderings, what the thing's going to look like when it's done. Now they are projecting 2036.
Yeah.
This is basically half a century to remodel an airport.
I have been flying in and out of LaGuardia since I was born. My mother's family is from New York. Mm-hmm. They're all still there. A lot of them live in Long Island. Mm-hmm. I have been going to LaGuardia as long as I can remember. I don't remember a time in my life that LaGuardia was not under construction.
Not under construction. We have a similar thing here in Denver. We had a big, we have a big VA hospital. It's still not fully finished. The original projection was $600 million. Just to give people sort of an idea of what you can go build one of the top big casino hotels in Las Vegas for that kind of money. Yeah. $600 million. It went at least 5 years past the deadline. They're still working on it today. And the last I checked, and it was a long time ago, the price tag had already tripled. Right. They were up to almost $2 trillion. I'm sorry, $2 billion for a hospital that was supposed to cost $600 million.
Maybe they should put some slot machines in and it'll help pay for it along the way. The other infrastructure project, though, that I think about, and it shows sort of when you finally tell progressives no, you can't let them start this in the first place. And that's the Boulder Turnpike, what they call now I think they call it the Buffalo Highway. It was renamed for CU, but it's Highway 36 from Denver to Boulder to get to the University of Colorado.
Right.
Been doing that drive as long as I can remember. Went to school there. Went up a lot as a kid. It was probably 10 years ago, maybe a little bit longer. They started a widening project on the Boulder Turnpike. And
I moved to Colorado in 2010, and they had just begun started that project.
Okay, so they were widening the highway. It was wildly mismanaged. It was totally poorly budgeted, and about a quarter of the way in, they ran out of money. There was just half roads.
Right.
There were expenses that nobody who had any experience in building a highway, they weren't prepared for. They didn't plan for certain things. And a quarter of the way in, the budget ran out. And they went back to the people of Boulder County and they said, we need more money. People of Boulder County said no. So what'd they do? They leased the highway for the next 25 years to a company. It's unclear still to this day, and this is sort of one of those behind the curtain of progressivism. Right. We don't always know what's going on.
Somebody's collecting a toll?
Somebody, either in California or Australia, we know it's in one of those two places. It might be both, have taken control of the Boulder Turnpike. What that's led to is extremely expensive HOV tolls. And I mean, we're talking what I used to pay in New York. Driving to my old office in New York, I would spend about $26 round trip every day in tolls. Right. We're looking at about the same thing if you drive on that road in the HOV lane during rush hour every day. And on top of that, no expansion of light rail of our supposed train system, whatever you want to call it.
Yep.
Because now the private industry, obviously they don't want government competition, so they said, we'll take over and we'll finish the road if you do it. This is one of those things that this is why you don't let government get involved in the first place. This is why you don't let – we had this fight over how much money should we be giving to the government to go take care of this road project. I was living in Boulder at the time. There was a huge fight in Boulder County. How much money should we be budgeting? Nobody was talking about maybe we shouldn't budget anything. Maybe we should figure out a different way to improve transportation from Denver to Boulder.
Well, being a capitalist who's not part of the government, I'm going to do a shameless little plug here because I offer a lot of examples in my book, Save the Swamp, available at Amazon.com and your favorite booksellers. And also, I want to offer here a very practical thing that our listeners can do with this information we're sharing. It is absolutely true that results don't matter for progressives when it comes to government programs. They tend to care only about the intentions, the marketing intentions, not the real nefarious intent. The real intentions are, let's expand government control and take more money from people. That's the real intention. But the marketing intentions are, we want to help people, we want to help the poor, we want to help lighten traffic, we want to, manage the climate of the earth and everything else. But here's a practical thing that our members can do as citizens. Before any new program gets created, whether at the state level or at the federal level, demand first that we do a review of the existing programs. Let's look at that first. Hey, Joe Biden, before any new infrastructure program, let's first revisit the war on poverty that's still being waged today.
Right.
How much money is being spent? What are the actual results of that? Let's look at the war on poverty. Let's look at Obamacare. Let's look at some of these great big let's look at the Federal Department of Education. How much money has it spent? How many employees does it have? How many of those employees are paying to federal government employee unions, which then go and donate money right to a bunch of Democrat political campaigns? Let's do a survey of the existing programs, and let's actually get our minds around the amount of waste and the corruption and the counterproductive results that have come for it before we start talking about any sort of new program.
And I'll add to that. There was a really good point brought up by one of our chapter members at one of our recent events that I was attending. We were commenting on the common comment from government that says, and from progressives in general, if we could just save one life.
Right.
How many lives were saved before you got involved?
Yes.
They like to pretend that everybody was dying before they got involved.
Yes.
Think about the war on poverty. If we could save just one life, how many lives were free markets saving before you started implementing a war on poverty?
I'll give you a great example, and this ties right in with FDR and the New Deal. One of the things the New Deal Democrats did is they passed a law regulating child labor. Kids certain ages could only work so much, and progressives to this day, 2021, still point to that and say, see, we care about children. If it wasn't for our law, kids would be working terrible hours. So I went back and actually looked a little bit. What was actually going on in the realm of child labor? And it turns out, going clear back to the middle part of the 19th century, in the 1800s, most Americans were farmers. And it is true, a lot of kids growing up on farms were pitching in and helping work on the farms. And you know what was happening in the 1870s and 80s and 90s? Growing numbers of Americans were being productive, and they were creating wealth. And as growing numbers of families became wealthier, they were able to buy equipment and not rely on their children. You know what they started doing with their children? Sending them to schools, all on their own, without any federal legislation. When they were productivity led to child labor rates going down and down and down, to the point where I'm talking rates had been up around 45, 50% of kids. I'm trying to remember the measurement. I think it was kids under 14 working. Up to 50% of kids under 14 had been working in, say, 1860. By the time you get to the New Deal in 1930, it was less than 1%.
Right.
There are hardly any kids under 14 years old doing any work at all. Most of them were in schools. And so the point is that legislation did absolutely nothing.
Right.
It was productivity and improvement in our life situation, creation of wealth that actually led to the reduction of child labor rates.
But you know what else that fueled? And let's go further back than the 1870s, 80s, 90s. All those kids who used to work on the farms, all of those kids who used to work those, the fields and in the heat, and I mean a lot of those were in like South Carolina and Georgia, where it's hot and it's humid and it's muggy and you just don't want to be out there.
Right.
Those kids started saying, "I want to do more with my life. I want to do something different. I want to figure something else out." They started reading books on their own. They started exploring things. It gave them a drive. It gave them a passion. As great as it is that fewer kids were working, that might have led us to this progressive world that we lived in today. I mean, I still remember my very first job was working in a warehouse, boxing sporting goods for like $4 an hour.
Right.
And I'll tell you, I said I'm never doing this again.
You were
in my
thinking
life.
there's got to be more to life than this,
There
right?
has to be more to life than this.
Yeah.
And the worst part, this is also the first time I realized taxes. And when you're making $4 an hour,
there's not a lot there.
And they're still taking taxes out, and your first paycheck for 2 weeks of work is like $32.
That's right.
You're just, this is not going to work for me for my life.
Yep. I think one of the big takeaways here is if Joe Biden wants to claim the mantle of FDR, we'll let him have it. Let's hang that around his neck. And what that means is all the disastrous things that FDR did and all the lives that he hurt and all the people that he hurt, and he made that economic misery drag out for nearly 2 decades, that's what Joe Biden is promising to do. And we need Americans to wake up and see exactly what's going on, which is another way of saying we need them to see behind the curtain.
Right.
We got to pull that. Stop looking at the fiery, smoky, big image being projected of Oz. That's not Oz. Oz is the little goofy guy with no particular talents or knowledge behind the curtain, pulling the levers and turning the dials. It's a smokescreen.
Right.
It's a distraction. It's an illusion. The solution to poverty always has been, always will be, wealth creation.
Right.
And wealth creation comes from increased productivity. You got to produce something that other people value. It's not from a government program, a government policy. Stop buying it.
Oz wasn't some great savior.
Nope.
Oz couldn't be some great savior. He was just a human being, and everybody in government, they're just human beings too.
That's right.
And they're flawed, and they're not perfect, and they're going to have problems, and they're going to have ill intent. They're not always going to actually care about the outcomes they pretend to say they have.
And that insight that we're all human beings, including the people in government. We're all human beings. That insight is at the core of the American idea. It's what makes self-government and individual liberty so precious, so important to preserve. It's why we are the guardians.
We will continue to fight. No somos custodes.